Today we're going to talk about the brainstem and the spinal cord. But first of all, we'll talk about the structure and function of the diencephalon before moving on to the structure and function of the brainstem, the different regions of the brainstem, and what they do. So what does the diencephalon actually consist of? Well, it consists of the epithalamus, which part of the epithalamus is the pineal gland, and that is involved in the secretion of melatonin. It's the thalamus, which acts as a relay station, so relays information and then sends it to the correct place. And the thalamus also helps to filter out that information that is deemed irrelevant. And then we've got the hypothalamus, which has a large array of roles with many nuclei present within it, which are involved in things like hunger and our emotional status, for example. And we'll talk about those later. But the whole point about the diencephalon is that it's integrating our sensory information with motor output at that subconscious level. So as I've mentioned, the epithalamus contains the pineal gland, and the pineal gland secretes melatonin, and that's involved in the regulation of our day-night cycle, but also in other animals and species, in particular in reproduction. You've got the ascending sensory information from the spinal cord, so sensory information coming from the spinal cord ascends through that spinal cord and through the brainstem. Likewise, we have our cranial nerves which are coming in, and they tend to, most of them, synapse in the thalamus. And at the thalamus, that's kind of like a relay station, and it processes that information, gives us a crude awareness of what that sensation is before sending it to the appropriate place within the cerebral cortex. Now, that might be in the occipital lobe, for example, at the back of the head, if we're thinking about visual sensation. So the thalamus is like a relay station, and then it goes on to reach the cerebral cortex, where we get proper conscious awareness rather than a crude awareness. The hypothalamus contains centers involved with our emotions, so part of our limbic system, our visceral system, so that's our internal organs, of course, and these are all autonomic processes that affect the cerebrum and our endocrine functions, amongst other things. And we'll talk about some of the roles of the hypothalamus now, but of course you must remember that the hypothalamus plays a crucial role within the endocrine system itself. So let's start with each of these. So let's go through each of these systems. We'll talk about the epithalamus first, which is fairly, we're not going to talk about it very much. So did you know cats and other mammals are on heat or in season when they're fertile and sexually receptive? Well, I would imagine that you did. Did you also know that the epithalamus secretes melatonin, and that is regulated by day length through the amount of light that actually reaches the pineal gland? So what I want you really to do is have a look at this image. And so all it's showing is we've got the sunlight there, and we get an increase in day length, so more sun, and that's detected by the pineal gland. Pineal gland is then talking to the hypothalamus, and what I want you to do is just read through this and really think, what do you think melatonin is mainly secreted during the day or at night, and why do you think that might be the case? So, of course, the protection, if you get more sunlight, you actually get less production of melatonin by the pineal gland. Therefore, less melatonin is reaching the hypothalamus, which is shown in this image nicely down here. And therefore, when you're getting less melatonin coming into the hypothalamus can now send more GnRH, that's gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, to the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary can then send off more FSH and LH to the ovaries, and therefore the animal goes on heat. So basically it's stimulating that whole system, making that animal more fertile, if you like, so because you're secreting the LH and FSH to start the ovulatory cycle. So and by starting that cycle, of course, when there is more sunlight, you're giving the babies that are coming out, whether that's kittens in the case of cats, etc., you're giving them a greater chance of survival because there's more sunlight, and there's therefore more likely to be the food that they require to eat around. So hence why the pineal gland plays such a vital role in other species. So we've also got the thalamus. So this, as I've already mentioned, is a relay station for information coming into the cerebral cortex from the basal nuclei, which is to do with subconscious movements, the cerebellum, which is also to do with movements. But as well as that, it receives all afferent impulses from all senses and all viscera. And so as those afferent impulses reach the thalamus, like I said before, we have a crude recognition of the sensation. So we kind of go, it might be pleasant, it might be unpleasant. So in other words, at this point, we're getting that crude information coming in. The information here is now edited. And the impulses with similar functions are relayed as a group to the appropriate sensory cortex and therefore the sensory, the association area. So it might be going to the visual cortex or to the auditory cortex, for example. But specific stimulus location, of course, and discrimination, that is occurring at the cerebral cortex, not at the thalamus itself. Like I said, that's very crude. And the thalamus also helps to screen out insignificant signals. So parents, for example, can sleep through traffic if they live near a busy road, but they'll wake up if they hear their baby cry. A great example that we've all actually been through is you might be in a pub or a bar somewhere chatting. You're chatting just say for sake of argument, chatting to one person, and there are other people around you, other friends around you, but you're not really listening to them, you're paying no attention. It's all being filtered out, it's all being ignored. The thalamus is saying, this isn't relevant, we don't need to listen to this. But then in a conversation nearby, someone says your name in the background, and all of a sudden your thalamus has detected this as relevant. And now what you find yourself doing is you're listening in to a completely different conversation whilst blankly ignoring the person you were talking to beforehand. And that's because your thalamus has heard your name and it's gone, this is now a relevant conversation, I need to listen to this, don't really need to listen to this person anymore. So you kind of switch off. And so that's why the thalamus is very important. It's helping to filter out relevant and irrelevant information for you. And that's what we're just saying there. So now the hypothalamus. Well, this is a collection of specific nuclei that are involved in integration of many homeostatic functions, whether that's your water balance and stress, because it synthesizes antidiuretic hormone, for example. It stimulates CRH, corticotrophic releasing hormone, which goes on to stimulate the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So it's involved in your long-term stress. It's got hunger centers, reproduction centers. We've already talked about that with gonadotrophin releasing hormone. It's involved in thermoregulation because it releases hormones that stimulate thyroid hormone or thyroxine, which increases your metabolic rate, producing more heat. It's involved in sleep-wake cycle, in fullness. So it has a whole array of different functions. And so it receives input from the cerebrum, from the brainstem, from the chemical composition of the cerebrospinal fluid, your interstitial fluid, and your blood. And it brings all that information together. And in doing so, it starts to directly regulate your internal environment. So a really good example of this is if when you're cold, okay, so you're shivering away, it doesn't happen very often in Queensland, admittedly, but when you're shivering away and it's really cold, this is all being regulated by the hypothalamus, so it's trying to make you warm again. So it increases heat production by causing shivering and stimulating the release of thyroid hormone. It leads to decreased heat loss through helping to stimulate skin vasoconstriction. And it acts as part of your limbic system, that's your emotional center, with the voluntary cerebral cortex to motivate you to put on a jumper or turn up the heating or other aspects that will help you get a little bit warmer. Importantly, it's also involved in the subconscious control of skeletal muscle movements. For example, the face expression changes that you might see when you're really angry or you're in pain or you're sexually aroused, you get facial expression changes, and that's all being controlled at the subconscious level, again, through the hypothalamus. You can see the number of roles this part of the brain actually has. So like I said, some of the roles that it has, it helps to control your body temperature. That's the example that I've already given you. Helps to control thirst and urine output through the synthesis of antidiuretic hormone and its subsequent release from the posterior pituitary. It helps to control food intake. You have fullness and hunger centers that are present there. It controls, as we've talked about, pituitary hormone release and synthesizes posterior pituitary hormones. And it controls uterine contractions and milk synthesis and release. So it's involved in the production of prolactin, which is involved in milk synthesis. Prolactin actually comes from the anterior pituitary, but it's being regulated via the hypothalamus. And oxytocin is made in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. And that's involved in uterine contractions and milk letdown or milk release. And as we've mentioned, it participates in your sleep-wake cycle, along with other aspects of the brain that we'll go through. So we've covered the diencephalon now, so we'll just have a little bit of a question. It's only at a crude level. So have a look at this question, press pause while you think about it, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so let's go through it. So which of the following are correct regarding the diencephalon? That means more than one might be correct, of course. The diencephalon contains the thalamus, which receives efferent impulses from all senses. That's incorrect. It receives afferent impulses from most senses. There are one or two where that doesn't go through the thalamus. The thalamus relays impulses with similar functions to appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. That, of course, is correct. So visual information goes to the visual cortex. Auditory information goes to the auditory cortex. The hypothalamus synthesizes and secretes oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. That is incorrect. The hypothalamus does synthesize oxytocin and it does synthesize ADH, but they then pass down nerve cells to the posterior pituitary and they are released and secreted into the blood from the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus helps regulate body temperature by stimulating arterial vasoconstriction when cold. So yes, it is involved in arterial vasoconstriction because, of course, it is talking to the brainstem all the time. So moving on to the brainstem, we're going to be covering through this. So the brainstem consists of three main parts. You've got the midbrain or the mesencephalon, you've got the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which is closest to the spinal cord. And then we've just highlighted, you can see the cerebellum, which is there, which is involved in smooth coordinated movements, of course, and the diencephalon that we've already talked about. So the brainstem itself is responsible for automatic survival functions. So we don't have any control over what's going on in the brainstem, no conscious control or voluntary control over it whatsoever. Most cranial nerves arise from the brainstem, almost all of them. There are only a couple that don't. And so the brainstem, really, it's the central core of the brain, beginning where the spinal cord swells as it enters the skull. And like I said, it's responsible for those automatic survival processes. So some of its functions, it's involved in breathing, in blood circulation, in swallowing, in urination. And then we've got the reticular formation. And the reticular formation itself has widespread connections throughout the brain, the cerebral cortex. And by stimulating the reticular formation, you arouse the brain as a whole. So therefore you can think, well, the reticular activating system is clearly going to be involved in maintaining consciousness and alertness. And therefore it's clearly going to be involved in sleep and arousal from sleep. So there are some good examples of how this might work. So if you think about it when you're driving along and you're getting a little bit sleepy, we've all been there, we're driving along, we're getting a little bit sleepy, we're a bit tired, we should pull over at the side of the road. But sometimes, rather stupidly, we don't. So what do we try to do? We try to wake ourselves up. And actually, by waking ourselves up, or trying to wake ourselves up, we're actually trying to activate the reticular activating system, because as you activate this, you activate the rest of your cerebral cortex, and of course you're becoming aroused and awake. So what do we do when we're driving our car and we're starting to feel asleep? Well, you might start by going, well, I'm feeling a bit sleepy, I'll put the aircon on. And you put that on to blast it onto cold, and you're stimulating those temperature receptors, which is therefore stimulating your reticular activating system and therefore stimulating your cerebral cortex. And then you might go, oh, God, that's not doing enough. I'll open the window so I get a massive breeze and a bit of noise coming onto me. And that wakes you up a little, but not quite enough. So then now you've got the aircon on, you've got the windows open, you're still nodding off a little bit, and you know you should be pulling over, but you don't. So you turn the stereo up really loud. Stereo, I'm showing my age by saying stereo. You're turning the music up loud to stimulate, again, your reticular activating system. You're trying to activate your brain, and again, you're falling a bit asleep, and you're going, oh, God, this isn't working either. I've done this before. I've then started to hold my eyelids open to try and keep my eyes awake rather stupidly. Should definitely have pulled over by now. But no, still falling asleep. So what do? As your last resource, you smack yourself in the face. You're starting to cause yourself pain rather stupidly. Again, sorry, I shouldn't have done this in my life, but I have. And so you're hitting yourself, stimulating your reticular activating system, and therefore trying to stimulate your cerebral cortex. So the whole point about this is really the reticular activating system, we're stimulating it all the time. Whenever you just get a sensation of touch or pain or pressure or vibration, this is all passing through the reticular activating system to activate your cerebral cortex as a whole, as well as going to the specific parts of the brain. So now we'll go through each little part of the brainstem at a very basic level. So the medulla oblongata, that's the most inferior part of the brain. So that's that's the part that is connecting, if you want to call it that, to the spinal cord. So all communication between the brain itself and the spinal cord involves those tracts that ascend or descend through the medulla oblongata. It's the center of coordination of relatively complex autonomic reflexes and the control of our visceral functions. In other words, some of these autonomic nuclei, they include centers such as the cardiovascular center, which adjusts stroke volume, adjusts heart rate and total peripheral resistance, so vasoconstriction and vasodilation. You've got your respiratory centers there. You've got the rhythmicity centers, so that generate respiratory rhythm, which includes your breathing rate and depth. And you've got additional centers such as vomiting, coughing, hiccuping, and sneezing. You also have the crossing of the pyramidal motor neurons within the medulla oblongata itself as well. So now we'll move up a little bit and we're moving into the pons. This is kind of it relays your sensory and your motor information. So it contains nuclei and tracts that process and relay information to and from the cerebellum, remember, and the cerebellum is all involved in smooth muscle movements. And pons literally means bridge, hence why it's wedged between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. The other thing is, as we've mentioned, you require it because it's processing that information to or from the cerebellum, so it's required for those coordinated smooth movements. And the ascending tracts, etc., are basically kind of talking or receiving and sending information to and from the midbrain, diencephalon, cerebrum, and the spinal cord. It does contain some respiratory centers, and you'll know this from your respiratory lectures already. So the pneumotaxic and apneustic centers that work with the medulla to help maintain respiratory rhythm. Now we'll go on to the midbrain. So the midbrain, this helps to regulate auditory and visual reflexes. So in other words, there are reflex centers that are present there. So it's containing nuclei that process visual and auditory sensations. So here we can see where they are. You've got the superior colliculus there, and you've also got the inferior colliculus. Now the superior colliculus receives visual information from the thalamus and leads to reflex movements of the eyes, neck, and head. So in other words, if you get something very, very bright lights coming in, then that causes you to turn your eyes, your head, and your neck away from that very bright light, for example. And the inferior colliculus does a similar thing, but this time with auditory information. So if you get very, very loud noises, you get reflex movements of the head, neck, and trunk to move away from that very loud noise. So those are the couple of reflexes that you have there. Superior colliculus is visual and inferior colliculus is auditory. As well as that, you can see that we have the substantia nigra, which is there. Now, and you can see the reticular formation because that runs through the entire brainstem in this image. And again, so the substantia nigra is present in the midbrain and it secretes dopamine. And dopamine inhibits the basal nuclei, so therefore it's functionally linked to the basal nuclei, degeneration of which, of course, is involved in Parkinson's disease with its associated movement issues. But that'll all be covered at a later point. So, a bit of a review question for you at this point. Which of the following statements are correct? So press pause, have a read, and then decide which ones you think are correct and which ones are not. Okay, number 1. Damage to the medulla oblongata can be lethal as it contains many vital reflex centers, such as those that control heart rate and blood pressure. That is correct, of course, and breathing reflexes. The midbrain regulates auditory and smell reflexes. No, it's auditory and visual reflexes, nice and easy. The inferior colliculus of the midbrain coordinates reflex movements following auditory stimuli. That is correct. Remember, your head, neck, and trunk move when you get too loud a noise, for example. And then, of course, superior colliculus coordinates reflex movements due to bright lights.